somewhere at a community center or a library. But tonight we're doing this obviously because of the pandemic and what's been going on. We are doing this virtually. We're trying to keep people safe, trying to adhere to health guidelines. So that results in us doing a Zoom meeting, and that's where we are right now and tonight. My name is Jack Amendolia. I'll be facilitating tonight's session. I'm a partner at Watson and Associates, and we're a firm in conjunction with Dr. Williams, who I'll introduce more formally in a second. But in conjunction with Dr. Williams, Watson was selected by your municipality to conduct this ward boundary review. So I do these studies at Watson. I'm joined tonight by Josh Valenti. He's doing some work behind the scenes tonight and helping us out. But as part of the ward boundary review, Josh is largely responsible for the population growth forecast, for population allocation, a lot of the technical work that makes up the ward boundary review. Obviously, when we're looking at wards, and we'll talk about this more in depth later on tonight, but obviously population parity and the role that population and growth has in your municipality is going to be a significant component. And that's really the major role that Watson plays in these ward boundary reviews, is focused and centered on that technical population related component. But as a second ago, I introduced Dr. Williams. We're going to informally refer to him as Bob, as he likes to be known. Bob is a specialist in municipal affairs, municipal politics, and governance. He's a retired professor from the University of Waterloo, retired professor in political science. And as a second career post-retirement, Bob has helped many municipalities across Ontario with these types of studies, with council composition and ward boundary review studies. And like I said, Watson is responsible for much of the technical aspect, the population-related aspect of a ward boundary review. But as we hope to talk about tonight, there are a lot more issues that we have to be concerned about. We'll talk about some guiding principles, but there's more that goes into a ward boundary review than just the population aspect of it. And Bob brings all of those skills that we need to make this an all-encompassing and thoughtful study to the ward boundary review. So what we're going to do tonight are a couple of things to help inform the public about this process and about this ward boundary review and why your municipality is doing it. We're going to watch a short video to start out tonight, a whiteboard video that's also available on the municipality's website. That's a few minutes long that I think gives a really quick, simple overview of what we're trying to do and some possible outcomes of this review. After we play that video, Bob and I will join you again, and we're going to do about a 25-minute presentation that gets into a bit more of the details. So the video will help introduce this topic, and then Bob and I will walk you through the methodology, the process, some of the legislative framework that surrounds ward boundary reviews, and talk a little bit about next steps as well. And then after that presentation, we'll leave some time for you, the public, to tell us any comments, any thoughts that you may have, ask questions that may come up throughout tonight's presentation or that you may have about the ward boundary review in general. Just a couple of quick housekeeping items before we start the video. So tonight, we're going to ask that video stay off and that we remain muted for the first part of tonight's session. When we get to the question and answer period, there's a couple of ways that you can engage with us. You can raise your hand and we'll unmute you, or you can unmute yourself and ask a question to us that way. Or if you're more comfortable in typing out a question, you can use the chat feature. We'll be monitoring that as the session goes on. So just type out your question, and then when we get to the Q&A part, we can read it out and answer it, hopefully. So again, we'll see you again in a couple of minutes, and hope you enjoy the short video. Thank you.
I'm going to take the next few minutes to talk to you about our ward boundary review. So what is a ward? Well, it's my home, your home, our neighborhood. A ward is part of Cavan Monaghan, where people vote for their representative on local and county council. Currently, Cavan Monaghan is divided into 3 wards. Cavan Monaghan's system of representation is governed by a 5-member council composed of a mayor, a deputy mayor, both elected at large, and 3 local councillors, one representing each ward. The current ward boundaries were established in 1998 and are based on the 2 pre-amalgamation townships and the village of Millbrook. It's been nearly a quarter century since we've taken a look at how we structure our wards. In short, it's time for this review. Since 1998, our population has grown by approximately 15% and is projected to continue growing. The review will look at our current ward system and see if we need to redraw the ward boundaries to account for this population growth. Why should you care? Well, it's part of our local democracy. It's the first step that lays out the ward where you will vote in the next municipal election. Every 4 years, you get to elect your representatives on local and county council. Your councillors make decisions on things like taxes, services, community centers, and new developments, to name a few. The wards may change as a result of this review, and you may want to provide input into how this is done so that your voice and opinions are considered even before you head to the polls. The purpose of the review is to group together residents and neighborhoods in such a way that each resident's vote is roughly equal to the votes of others. The external team working on this review will talk to the current councillors and consult residents throughout the process. Initial consultations with the public are beginning in December. Later on, you will see some ward options that you will be able to review and comment on. In the end, Council will consider a report with the ward options and decide what is best for the township while understanding the needs and opinions of the community. Make sure your voice is heard during our ward boundary review. Here's what you need to do. Get informed. Visit kevinmonaghan.net/WBR to find out more and to fill out the surveys. And remember to follow Kevin Monaghan on social media to find out more about future meetings.
Okay, so like I said, I hope that video set the table a little bit for the rest of our discussion tonight and started to introduce some of the topics that Bob and I will try to walk you through in a little bit more detail. So we're going to move to the presentation portion of tonight's session. So we're going to get started in just a second. I'm just going to give Josh a minute to bring the presentation up, and then we'll get into that. So if we move to the first slide of the presentation, what I want to do first is just talk a little bit about what we're going to go through tonight. So as I mentioned in the introduction tonight, obviously we want to walk through why the municipality is doing a ward boundary review. And I think the video started to touch upon some of those issues, primarily that it's been about a quarter century since the wards were set, and that your municipality has changed and it's not the same place as it was when the wards were initially configured. Bob is gonna, in a couple of minutes, walk you through the legislative framework as well as provide a little bit of context and history as to why we're at the situation we're at now. And then we're going to talk a little bit about evaluation and some of the early issues. And what I mean by that is walk us through the wards as they exist now, and in relation to the guiding principles that I talked about a couple of minutes ago, and decide whether we think that the existing wards meet those guiding principles or whether we think some things can be done to help the structure out. And then, like I said, we're going to turn it over to you and hopefully get some feedback in terms of helping us with some perspectives, answering some questions for you. Really, this first phase is really about a few things that we want in terms of outcomes. Obviously, we want to create some awareness about this project. We want an information exchange. So we want to provide information to the public so that they can provide some good feedback to us. But it's really about us learning as well, and hopefully garnering some new perspectives from feedback that we hear. And ultimately, and we'll talk about this more, but I did mention the guiding principles already a couple times. If there's one really important issue that we want to get excuse me, feedback from, it is some priority about the guiding principles. So if we move to the next slide, At every ward boundary review that we do, there's obviously some unique issues that we want to try to drill down and see what's unique to your municipality. But ultimately, we're trying to figure out a few things that are consistent with most ward boundary reviews that we do. So we ask some high-level questions. How well does the present structure serve the citizens of your municipality right now? Does the present structure provide fair and effective representation? And Bob's going to talk a little bit more about what fair and effective representation means a little later. And ultimately, if the answers are yes to those questions, if we do that evaluation and we think that the structure that you have now is ultimately good for your citizens, then in effect, our work is done, and we as consultants, we can sort of pack up our bags, tell your council that we think everything is good, and we go home. However, if the answer to those two questions happens to be no, then we really have to ask a third question, and that third question is really at a focal question as part of this ward boundary review, and that's, would an alternative system provide better representation for the citizens of your municipality? So to that end, I'm going to pass things over to Bob. And like I said, he's going to spend the next few minutes, first of all, giving you a little bit of context, a little bit of history of your municipality, your existing structure. And Bob, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Jack. The starting point, of course, is when the new township of Cavan Monaghan was created as part of a reorganization within Peterborough County. It's essentially an amalgamation of two townships and a village to create a single municipality. The key part of that is that the new council was elected on the basis of those old municipalities. Essentially, each one of the parties got one seat on the new council with an additional member we'll talk about in a moment. Now, we understand that back in 2015, there was some thought about perhaps reviewing that situation to do a review of the kind we're doing now, but for reasons that no one shared with us, that process did not go forward. So we're essentially now picking up 22 years later where things started back in 1998. And of course, one of the things that's happened is that there has been growth. The absolute numbers may not be large, but we're talking about a growth of about 20% in the municipality from amalgamation to the present day. So we're looking at some things that have changed the dynamics of the community that have not necessarily been reflected in the decision-making structure, which still consists of a mayor. Every municipality must have a mayor. And in your case, you have a deputy mayor who serves also on county council. The mayor and the deputy mayor are elected across the whole municipality. But then you have three other members of council who are elected in separate wards. And those wards, again, go back to the left side of the chart, namely representing or embodying the three pre-amalgamation municipalities. So the next slide basically asks a pretty basic question. Why are we doing a review? Why would anyone want to do a ward boundary review? We'll come to a couple of points in a moment, but in a sense, this is about reevaluating the structure that was put in place. And our role as consultants is to prepare the council to make decisions in a basic sense on whether to maintain the existing ward structure or to adapt an alternative. And the key part of that is that it's council that makes that decision. So we are recommending to council certain kinds of outcomes. We, the consultants, don't make the change. Council needs to make that change. So the next slide helps us understand where that authority comes from. And the left side essentially is the summary of what's included in the Municipal Act, which basically has 3 points related to these questions. Cavan Monaghan is what's called a lower tier municipality. It's part of the county of Peterborough. As a lower tier municipality in Ontario, this council has 3 responsibilities or 3 opportunities to address representation. One, it has the power to define the size of the council. As we've just seen, it's a 5-member council. And under the Act, that's the minimum size for a municipal council in Ontario. It can go from there up to any number. At one point, the City of Toronto was going to have a council of 47 members. That's now 24, but other municipalities make the decision to have a council of a certain size. Cavan Monaghan's council is the bare minimum, and it's been that way since 1998. The second point is that under the Act, council can determine how those councillors will be elected. Now, as I said a moment ago, the mayor must be elected in what's called a general vote or at large. Can't change that. You have a deputy mayor elected under the same rules and 3 councillors who are elected in wards. That is, again, a choice. How are we going to elect the members of council? If it's determined, and we'll touch on some of this later, if it's determined that they will be, some of them anyway, will be elected in wards, then council has the authority, and the phrase is to divide or redivide the municipality into wards or to dissolve the existing wards. So working backwards, this council could have the authority to basically say, thank you very much, consultants, we're not going to have wards at all. We're going to elect all 5 of our members of council at large. We happen to think that that's probably not a good idea, but that is still a possibility. The other part is to say, if you have no wards, you can divide the municipality into them. But of course, in this case of Cavan Monaghan, you already have wards. So what we're talking about is the authority to redivide the municipality into wards. Keep it the way it is or redivide it. The right side of the slide adds some other parts of this. And while the left side talks about what you can do and what is in the legislation, the right side is talking about what's missing. And surprisingly enough, the legislation says nothing about any of these things. There's no schedule. You don't have to do it after any particular period of time. There's no standard process you need to follow, as opposed to, for example, amendments under the Planning Act or various other pieces of legislation. There's no process that's required. And beyond that, there's no criteria to tell you, well, what should a ward system look like? What should wards look like? What would be a good system? That's completely absent from legislation. So the first bullet is basically confirming that every municipality that decides to do a review must set its own terms of reference. What's going to be considered? What kinds of timetable? Who's going to be consulted? Who's going to do the review? All those kinds of things, plus what we're calling here guiding principles. What will a good system look like? All of those things have in fact been put in place here in Cavan Monaghan, but that's entirely a local process. Now, this is not something that happens without any reference to other municipalities or without any reference to, let's call it, experience. And that's part of what the Watson and Associates and I bring to this. We have conducted reviews in more than 20 municipalities, and we've offered to the municipalities some ideas about what this might look like. So the review is framed around procedures. I call them established procedures here, things that we know have worked successfully, and that's what we bring to it. And framed by principles that are drawn from many other Ontario municipalities, modified a little bit perhaps to deal with your own circumstances, but principles that we know have been found to be acceptable in the past by the Ontario Municipal Board when issues have come up, and presently by the Local Planning Appeal Tribunal, or LPAT. Now, LPAT has not actually ever done any decisions yet because it's come in place since since the last reviews were done. But we know in future that will be the body. But those decisions amount to a form of case law about what is good, what is appropriate, what should be considered. And there are a few other judicial rulings, in particular, one very important one at the Supreme Court of Canada on representation, that have found their way into this kind of review. Over to you, Jack.
Thanks, Bob. So I'm going to jump right off of what Bob was talking about in terms of the process that Watson and Bob have come up with over the years, and something that we think not only works, and something that works well in terms of providing good information to the public and to council, but also one that takes into account what Bob just went through, best practices, principles, case law, and something that we hope then, if we hope that this doesn't get appealed, obviously, but if it does, we think that the process that we've established is something that is defensible. So that process, as I talked about earlier, we're really into two phases in this review. This first phase is really more about, as I discussed, awareness and information exchange. And it's really the second phase where we're going to get into, again, assuming we determine that there is a need for reconfiguration of the wards, it's a second phase where we'll get into that. So in the first phase, really we started out, we talked a lot about the skills and the experience that the consultant teams bring to this review because of other reviews that we've done. However, I think Bob mentioned it when he was speaking, we are outsiders. So one of the first things we want to try to do in any review is get to know the municipality that we're working in as best as we can, and try to identify some of the history, some of the issues that have led to this review. So one of the ways we do that is obviously through research, through looking at different past reports or staff reports or cultural reports, anything we can kind of get our hands on to get an idea of, like I said, the history and some data that backs that up. Another way we do that is through interviews. So we have interviews. One of the first steps in this process is we have interviews with your council, with your mayor, with your deputy mayor, as well as with senior staff. And again, to try to gain some context, some perspectives that as outsiders we might not be privy to. And again, something that's important there, and it may come up again a little bit later on, one thing I want to stress is these interviews with council, they're an information gathering exercise. So it's not so much that we're going to council and saying, what do you think the wards should look like? But it's more about information awareness, and like I said, more importantly, gathering some perspectives. We take that information and we do a few things with it. We prepare a discussion paper that's available on the municipal website now. And that discussion paper tries to roll some of that research and some of our early evaluations that Bob will get into tonight into a paper that hopefully can provide the public with some information that then allows you to provide better feedback to us. In addition to the discussion paper, and this really leads into number 4, public consultation, we prepare content and information that the municipality can put on their webpage. So you see at the bottom of, I think, every slide that we're showing tonight, you see that it has the municipal website with a /WBR. And that's a web page that has been dedicated to the ward boundary review process. On that page, you'll find FAQs, you'll find the video that we showed tonight, you'll find some content about the issues, like I said, the discussion paper, a wealth of information there that hopefully helps inform the public about this process. And also, and we'll talk about this a couple of times tonight, there's also a survey there. And that survey, I mean, we'll take feedback any way we can get it, email us, call us, talk to us tonight. But the survey is a really important source of feedback because it gives us a consistent way to analyze some very specific questions and responses. So if there's one thing that I would say to the public, if you only do one thing during this ward boundary review process in terms of engagement, please fill out that survey. So I talked a little bit earlier about guiding principles and that these studies are done, as Bob went through, based on some best practices, case law, but ultimately there's a rationale and a background to these reviews, and they're provided to us in the form of these guiding principles. And these guiding principles are based largely on what we said, best practices, case law, the decision Bob just spoke about, the Supreme Court Carter decision, laid out some of these as well, especially the idea of effective representation that Bob will get into a little bit more deeply in a moment. But these really help frame the study, and not only in terms of when we come up or if we come up with ward boundary reconfigurations, but they also give us a tool for which to evaluate in a consistent way your existing structure and your existing ward boundaries. So I'll really quickly go go through what some of these mean when we talk about guiding principles. So effective representation, we talked about a couple of times, and like I said, I'm not going to spend a ton of time here because I'm going to let Bob give you a more thorough explanation. But when we talk about effective representation, we refer to it as this overarching guiding principle. And really what that means is that to achieve proper effective representation in your award design or your award configuration, it really relies on the other guiding principles that I'll explain in a moment being met, or at least the majority of those principles being met to have effective representation. And when we talk about some of the main guiding principles that are, like I said, the basis really of this review, the first one, and probably one that's most known to most people, is representation by population. And many people have heard the term rep by pop. And when we talk about that, it's simply referring to population parity. It's the idea that each ward should be represented by a similar population or a similar number of people. The next principle that helps frame this study is one that we say representation of communities of interest. And what we're talking about here is trying to ensure that if there are well-known historical villages or hamlets, if there's areas that are similar, like rural areas or urban areas, that they're as much as we can kept in one ward. Not what we try not to do. What I say is probably pretty obvious, but we try not to. And Bob will talk about this in the evaluation of your current wards. But we try not to draw a ward boundary that's going to go right through a hamlet or right through a village or right through a significant community of interest. The next principle is population electoral trends. And really what that means, it relates back to representation by population. But one thing we do in these reviews is we're not looking at only the existing population, but we want to ensure that, you know, we're not giving you something that's going to be out of date tomorrow. We want to do something that looks at 3 election cycles. So when we talk about population parity, we want to be sure that there's population parity for your wards today or for the 2022 election, but also for the 2026 and the 2030 election. So looking into the future and ensuring there's population parity based on forecasted growth. And the last one has to do with ensuring that any ward boundary is identifiable. So if there are significant geographical or topographical features like a river or major arterials or highways or railroad tracks, something that we can visually see, something that's a clear definition when you're walking around or driving around, that you can tell where that ward boundary line. And again, in the evaluation, Bob will show you a couple of examples of the existing wards where that is difficult to recognize. So those are really things that we try to ensure are part of any ward boundary reconfiguration or redesign that we may come up with. So I'm going to pass it over to Bob for this next portion of the session. Well, actually, no, I think I'm gonna ask and answer these questions, and then I'll let Bob try to actually answer some of these through the evaluation of the existing wards. So I mentioned at the very beginning, there were sort of these general questions that we try to answer as part of every ward boundary review. And then we try to get a little bit more focused and try to drill down to issues that are specific to your municipality. And those questions then start to reflect some of those things we're trying to answer here. So we talk about, are 3 local councillors appropriate for a township of around 10,000 inhabitants? So want to ensure that when we're looking at ward, the existing ward system and the existing structure, that representation is something that we think is appropriate. Does the size and makeup of the existing wards allow for effective representation to be achieved? And Bob will go into to that in quite a bit of detail in the next few slides. Do the existing wards adhere to the guiding principles? So this relates back to what I just spoke about. In any evaluation, we have a set of consistent principles that help us provide a coherent and I think viable evaluation. And ultimately, what are the strengths and weaknesses of having a ward-based system in Cavan Monaghan? As Bob said, I mean, to do a thoughtful review, that's one of the questions that we have to ask. Ultimately, I think you'll find out through tonight and through the rest of this process that we think it does make sense to have a ward system in your municipality. But again, these are questions, like I said, to do a thoughtful review that we must ask and answer. So again, now I'm going to pass it over to Bob, and he'll try to answer some of these questions and show you the tools that we've used to evaluate your current structure. Bob?
Right. Thank you, Jack. So we start with the present system. Does it work? Does it achieve what the principles that we're asked to consider for the future? If we want to look at a new system, we need to check the existing one to see, in a sense, where the gaps are, where the shortfalls are, whether there are elements of that we should retain or things that might be modified, and the degree of change would depend on how well it fits. So we look at the current system to determine whether it constitutes an equitable system. That is it fair? And is it effective? Does it allow people to be represented in a way that's consistent with these expectations that we've laid out? So we start with the current system, look at the, if you will, the pros and cons. We're going to be doing that. We're also, in a sense, tapping into that in the survey that we're talking about, because we need to hear from the council, from the community rather, whether there are things that they feel are not to their, if you will, their advantage, or not in their interests, or not. And so those shortcomings help us to think about what we might want to consider as alternatives. And I want to be very clear at this point, we haven't done any of that yet. We haven't looked at other ways of dividing up Cavan Monaghan. Part of that comes from the very last point in the previous bullet. Do you still believe you should have wards? That's a key question. My sense is at the moment that wards are the right way to go in Cavan Monaghan, but we need to hear from the community about whether that's still appropriate. And if they believe that wards are appropriate, then we move on to look at where are the difficulties, where are the shortcomings rather, and what could we do. So the next slide is basically our take. As Jack said earlier, we're outsiders. We don't live in the municipality. We don't serve on the council. We don't try to work within it. So these are our initial takes on what we see here that are pertinent to the application of the guiding principles. And the very first one, given that it's on that list about representation by population, it's very clear that the evidence tells us that the present wards do not adhere to the representation by population principle. If you were to design the wards today with the goal of having what's called population parity among the three wards, you would not use the wards that are currently in place. The second part is that while the growth is, in percentage terms, is reasonable, 20%, the figure used earlier, maybe the actual numbers are not that high, but the growth is such that in terms of what we know now, the imbalance reflected in that first bullet will actually only get worse over the next three elections. Our goal in this review is to provide a system that can work over three elections. You've got an imbalance now, and for those of you who know the township well, you will realize that the growth that's going to take place and where it's going to take place will in fact only make the largest ward even bigger than it is now. So the next slide gives us a bit of a base for that discussion. There is a growth that has happened roughly since the wards were created. This starts a little bit earlier, but runs through the decades since that time, and shows us that there has been fairly important growth in the township overall, but it has tended to be concentrated in one of the wards. And I made this point early on that the wards were basically the three component parts, and they were simply turned from a municipality into a ward. And as best we can tell, and I'm not trying to second guess those who made that decision, population was not the factor. It was the historic ward. So Cavan Ward now includes about 66, two-thirds of the whole municipality's population are in a single ward. North Monaghan is half of what it should be, because the expectation is it's around 33%. If it's 333, or sorry, one third, one third, one third. Cavan Monaghan is much lower. Millbrook is somewhere in the middle. So that's the imbalance we're talking about. This is not a system of equitable representation. So the next slide repeats those points, but because this is not an evaluation strictly based on population, but does involve these other principles we've talked about. And again, those of you who are familiar with the map of the township would know that Cavan Ward is disproportionately large, not just in terms of the population I just mentioned, but the geography. It is a huge territory in comparison to the other two wards, which in terms of representation means that the councillor representing that ward is not only dealing with the most people, but with a huge territory. And in terms of staying in touch, being able to visit sites and various events and whatever, it's a much greater burden than it is on the other two. And that's part of that equity, both from the point of view of the resident and from the point of view of the councillor. We also notice as an outsider that the wards tend to not have boundaries that accurately reflect the communities within them. Now, again, there are not that many boundaries when we look at the map, but it's interesting that the boundary between the Cavan Ward and the North Monaghan Ward runs right up through the middle of those few communities that happen to be in that part of the municipality. 5 Mile Turn, Springville rather. The line somehow cuts through places and puts some of the residents in one ward and some in another, even though those are single locations. Millbrook is similarly disadvantaged by the boundary because it essentially is based on that the original municipality, but an awful lot of residences and activities that consider themselves normally part of Millbrook are actually in Cavan Ward, so that the ward boundary divides up the broader Millbrook community as opposed to the old municipality. And that's on that last bullet. The boundaries are unclear. And in particular, I would make a reference to Millbrook, where the line is quite erratic, if you will, around the municipality based on decisions made some time ago about where the village would be. But as we can see in this map, that green section, it's quite as I said, an irregular line. It's not using obvious boundaries. It's not natural features. It's basically lines on a map. And that if you were to try to figure out where the boundary actually lies, you'd have to really be an expert, if you will, on this question to know when you leave Millbrook Ward and enter Cavan. And you can see the same up there in that line between the North Monaghan Ward and the Cavan Ward. The line runs through what are referred to on here as settlement areas, which is a term that would be relevant, if you will, to planning and other matters. But those lines don't match the wards. As we see in Millbrook, there are areas that are part of the Millbrook settlement area that lie outside the ward. So to us, those are things that probably don't make a lot of sense. The people who live in that area, I'll just stick on the Millbrook for a moment. If you live north of Millbrook, outside that green area, you're really in a ward that covers the whole length of the municipality and almost the whole width. You're part of Millbrook, but you're not. And that's the kind of thing we would want to determine whether we can bring those two into sync, if you will, that the people and the settlements that are really part of Millbrook are, for electoral purposes, put together in a single ward. So the last thing I want to talk about in this presentation is this notion of effective representation. Now, as Jack alluded to earlier, this is a concept that came out of an important decision from the Supreme Court of Canada, which was asked to look at a method of representation in the context of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which talks about equality. Equality of representation is a part of it. And the court basically said, well, equality is an important goal, but it can't always be possible to achieve it. What we want to look at, though, is why you have a vote at all. You don't just have a vote to put your hand up once in the municipal case every 4 years. You have a vote to gain representation. You select someone who will represent your interests on council. You have someone who is in touch with you if you have problems, issues of that sort. It's about that relationship. Effective representation means that each resident should have comparable access to their elected representative. As we said, you're not likely to get it to exact parity. And of course, when we look back at the map, there are huge areas where the population is quite dispersed, where it would take an awful lot of territory to get to parity. So you can't say it's got to be direct, but it's comparable. Low population, large area. Of course, in Cavan, it's the opposite. Large area, large population. That in our view tends to hamper effective representation. And conversely, when a councillor is sitting at the council table, participating in a debate, and then is asked to vote on a matter, are they all speaking for roughly the same number of people? No. We know that when the councillor from North Monaghan, whoever that is over the years, puts up her or his hand, he's really making that vote on behalf of 14% of the population. But that person's colleague over in Cavan Ward putting up a hand for one vote is representing 2/3 of the population. Effective representation means bringing those down to some kind of reasonable balance. So our overall assessment is that the current population disparities between the wards are really too great to achieve what we mean by effective representation. So I said it's a bit of an abstract concept rather, but one that helps us understand what the end result is. You need to be effectively represented.
So that brings us back to a couple of times I mentioned tonight that we're ultimately trying to answer some questions, some of those higher level questions, and then through Bob's evaluation, some of those more specific questions. Ultimately going back to what I talked about near the beginning of tonight's presentation, if some of those answers are no in terms of does the structure provide effective representation, then we ask that next question, do the wards need to be changed? And as Bob mentioned, we're at a preliminary stage. We're still evaluating feedback, and we want to continue to hear from the public. But obviously, based on what Bob just walked us through in that initial evaluation, it doesn't seem that the existing wards adhere to the guiding principles that we've laid out in this study. So it would lead us to believe that we should come up with some scenarios that look at reconfiguration options. Before we move off of this talk about guiding principles, there is one thing that I do want to go through, and I think we've tried our best to hit on this throughout the discussion tonight or the presentation, is that there are going to be a balancing of principles, and we need that to hear really from the public. And I spoke about this tonight about what the residents of this municipality feel should be most important to us in terms of designing new ward boundaries. Should it be population parity? Should it be the communities of interest we spoke about? Which one is most important? Obviously, we're going to try to design a system that tries to adhere to all or most of those principles. But if there is a trade-off, or perhaps not a trade-off, but a balancing or a prioritization of those principles, it helps us when we're designing boundaries to know what's most important to you. So that is important. And like I said, please fill out the survey because there are questions that are specific to the guiding principles and what your community thinks is most important. if we move on to the next slide, I'm going to spend the last couple of minutes of the presentation portion talking about two things. Just reiterating the role of council that we went through a little bit earlier, and then I'll finish off just talking a little bit about public participation and the public's role. So the role of council, we spoke about. Obviously, we've gotten information from council. We've interviewed them. They've been a valuable resource in providing some history and context to this study. But we want to ensure the public that we do these studies, and Bob has mentioned a couple times that we're outsiders, that we're consultants who've been asked to come in and really provide an objective review and objective options for council and the public to consider. So we do these studies at arm's length from council and staff. And I said this at the very beginning tonight, we don't ask questions, or we don't want input into what they think a ward boundary should look like, or where we should move that line. It's more about an information gathering exercise rather than advice on recommendation. So this is an objective arm's length exercise from council and staff. All members of council, like I said, were invited to participate in an interview, and all members of your council, including the mayor and deputy mayor, did participate and provide some great information to us. And again, just before we move off this point, Bob talked about the legislative framework and what council has the authority to do. So ultimately, when we talk about next steps, when we come up with ward reconfigurations, we'll obviously vet these through a public consultation process again. Ultimately, our task is to come up with recommendations to council on possible ward redesigns. At that time, council has the option to do a couple of things. They can establish the number of councillors, so they can decide whether your council size becomes bigger or not. And they can also decide whether that council will be elected by general vote or wards, or by any combination of general vote and wards. Then once that's decided, the next thing they can decide is they can elect to pass a bylaw that would redivide or reconfigure the wards. And I mentioned quickly on that last one. So the first part, if they decide to make any changes to the size of council or how council is elected, that's not something that can be appealed. That decision is final. However, the decision, if they pass a bylaw to reconfigure the wards, that is appealable, as Bob talked about earlier, to local planning appeals tribunal. So to finish off tonight, we'll talk about what remains to be done in this consultation process. So obviously, we think it's a pretty important process, and we think that this process is enhanced with a public engagement and a public participation component. We think that if we can design wards, ensuring that we've heard from the public, and we can tell your council that our designs are based on, or include, is perhaps a better way to put it, include feedback that we've heard, we think that it makes the reconfigurations more viable and hopefully something that can work for your municipality. One thing I want to go through, so I talked about how because of the pandemic, because of guidelines, we've been forced to do a more virtual process, relying more on websites and video calls and this online engagement type platforms. But I want to make it clear to the public and to council as well, is that we have tried to be as diverse and hit as much of a cross section of your municipality as possible. So in addition to the online things I already spoke about, we also had some print engagement. So there was print materials that went out, media releases. There was a radio ad that was advertising the open houses as well. So we really tried to ensure that if you weren't internet or tech savvy, if you had broadband issues, if this just wasn't your preferred choice, that you had other avenues available to you. Even for the open house, for these sessions themselves, you have the option to either log on through a computer or to call in if technology or internet was an issue. So again, we've tried to put this out and make as many people as aware as possible. Signage, a bunch of different things that we hope has reached a good, like I said, cross section of your municipality. So what's left for you to do in this process? Well, if we move to the next slide, a couple of things that we want. Be willing to continue to ask questions, comments, provide feedback. I don't believe there's any such thing as a bad question. I think it could always create some good discussion. So again, don't be shy in the next couple of minutes when we have an opportunity to engage. Type some questions out, raise your hand. And if tonight, you're not comfortable doing it here, there's other avenues, as I said, through the municipal website and the webpage dedicated to this process. Please read the materials if you can. The discussion paper that I mentioned, other content on the website, watching the video again. The more you know about this process, the more informed you are. We think the better feedback that you're going to be able to provide to us. And again, not to belabor this, but if you do one thing and one thing only, please fill out the survey that you can find on the township's website. Like I said, it does provide us some valuable, consistent analysis and information. So that's going to end the presentation portion of tonight. But as I mentioned, we really want to turn it over to the public now. So if there's any questions, any comments, anything you want to say, keep it to the ward boundary review. Please be respectful. But now's your chance to let us know your feedback. Okay, so we don't see any questions as of yet. And I'll just reiterate too what I mentioned earlier. If you sort of look at the bottom center of your screen, there's a little chat feature. So if you click on that, that'll bring up a chat box and you can type in questions there and we're monitoring it. Or if you like, you can raise your hand and that'll let us know that you have a question and you can ask that way. So while we're waiting for some feedback or some questions, I'm going to bring a question up that relates back to the guiding principles that perhaps Bob could provide some commentary on. And it's something that comes up in other ward boundary reviews. There's a few guiding principles that we talked about, and we mentioned that they're all important. We try to create designs that adhere to all of them, but I mentioned that it's very difficult in some cases to use all of them. So Bob, can you provide a little bit of commentary, or if I ask the question, is there a guiding principle that should dominate the others in this ward boundary review process?
I'm happy to speak to that, Jack. The point, of course, is that effective representation is the ultimate goal, but the other four principles feed into that. The basic starting point should be population parity. That would be the ultimate goal, and if you could get to that, your result would be unquestionable. So that would be the best thing to aim for, parity if possible, but recognizing that parity in of itself is not the only thing that matters. And the court and many OMB decisions since have made it clear that population parity is not the only thing that matters. You can't ignore it. I think it'd be fair to say that it should not be given no consideration, but it needs to be built into a consideration of these other factors. So that would be, if there is a single goal, that would be it, recognizing that it has to be filtered, if you will, through those other perspectives. And quite clearly what we're facing with in a municipality like Cavan Monaghan and a great many others is to keep certain communities together. It may not be possible to create population parity, but we should work toward that goal as the result, and in a sense extend the boundaries in such a way that to make that possible.
Thanks, Bob. I'm just going to go back to the chat. We have a couple of comments and questions. So the first one is from Matthew, and Matthew asks, what is the timeline for the review process, next steps, etc.? So I'll start that off, and maybe Bob, if I miss anything, you can fill in. So the exact timelines haven't been set yet, but I could speak to some general timelines. So and within that, hopefully talk a little bit about next steps as well. So a couple of things in terms of timelines, obviously our next step after tonight is the survey is still going to be open for a while. We still want to give the public some chance to comment on this initial phase of discussion paper. But ultimately, our next step is to take all that information, and then sometime in the new year, we'll start to work on ward boundary reconfiguration. So start to look at the existing system, the issues that we discussed tonight, and say, is there, and this relates back to the questions we asked in the presentation, is there a way that we can redesign the ward system in Cabinet Monaghan and meet some of these guiding principles and deal with some of these issues? So again, that should happen sometime early in the new year. And then our next step would be from that to provide or prepare an interim report. That interim report will form the basis for this next phase of public consultation. And that interim report, most importantly, will include some preliminary ward boundary review options that we then will take out to the public in phase 2 of this process. And that's where we're hoping to get some feedback on really, what do you like best about these designs? What don't you like? Is there a design that you think works better than the others? In terms of feedback too, is there something that we've missed? Is there a design there that maybe we should create a hybrid with? So that's really that next major step, is getting feedback on the preliminary options and scenarios we create. From that, again, we would take all that feedback and provide final recommendations to council. So we would provide a final report that would go through a couple of final options and recommendations to council. And then going back to what we talked about in the presentation, then it would be up to council to, council's choices are obviously they can stay with the status quo. They can or can elect to go with one of the options we've presented them with. If they do so, then the municipality, again, dealing with the ward boundary reconfiguration, if they did so, they would then have to pass a bylaw to make it final. The intention is to have all of that done hopefully by June of 2021, so before the summer of 2021. Bob, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah. The other part of that, of course, is that a bylaw that redivides the municipality can be appealed to the local planning appeal tribunal. Any resident could do that. That follows a 15-day notification period of passing of the bylaw, 45-day appeal period. So roughly 2 months from passing the bylaw, it could be appealed. And if that's the case, LPAT would then have to schedule a hearing to get a result by basically a little later than this next year, by December 31st, 2021. So we're working, that June date is to work back from that, to say if in the event there's an appeal, the process is in place. I've yet to hear of OMB missing that deadline, but it can be a bit hairy at times late in the year. But if that were the case, we've given them time to do that. So our goal is to try to do this by the end of June, or depending on council timetables, as close to that as we can. And the process of consultation leading up to that is appropriate. We want to hear from the community. We don't want to make that a very short period, but we need to give enough time for the community to respond and for us to basically absorb those in that perspective and perhaps rework what we're saying. So that's essentially what we're looking at probably over the next 6 months as the basic direction.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Bob. I'm going to go to a couple of comments that Al made, and I might need some clarification on one of them. So it says just to provide some commentary on going to a 4-in-1 system, so a mayor and 4 councillors. So Al, maybe and maybe we can take a guess at this. So are you referring to a mayor and 4 councillors at large, or a mayor, no deputy mayor, and 4 councillors elected in 4 wards? 4 wards. Okay, Bob, do you want to address
right.
that?
Okay, and the point there would be that we would still have a 5-member council, the minimum size in Ontario. So what would disappear from that scenario, as I understand the question, would be electing a deputy mayor in a separate election. People only are nominated for that office. They compete for that office, and that is the current practice. so leaving 3 in wards. This scenario, it sounds to me like it would be saying you've got a mayor elected at large, you have 4 councillors elected in 4 wards, and to come up with a deputy mayor who would represent the municipality on county council, then you'd have to figure out some other way to make that choice among the sitting councillors. That is permitted. That's an arrangement that can be made and has happened in many municipalities where the deputy mayor's position is taken from one of the 4 wards, which means, of course, the issue of 3 wards is superseded by 4 wards. There are a number of weaknesses, if I can call it that, in that model. It does mean that the only possible person who could sit on county council has to already be elected to the township council. So that limits the candidates to 4 people. And many communities have done that. We've just gone through a review recently over in Trent Hills in Northumberland County, where they worked in the opposite direction, where the deputy mayor had always been elected from within, and they've now just converted to make it an at-large position. Those are possibilities. I think our answer is that each one has strengths and weaknesses, and the direction at this point is not to make that change. But if that's what people are telling us they would like to see happen, that's what the survey is about. Can you give that consideration? Can you lay out for us in the next phase what that might look like? And I think if there is certainly a sense that there is an appetite for it, then we would do it. If there's no apparent appetite, I suspect that we would probably just stick with the current arrangement as the 3 wards and the deputy mayor elected at large. Again,
Yeah, and
pros and cons for each one.
yeah, and just to reiterate some of that, I mean, it's not necessarily part of our mandate. We do talk about council composition, and that would only be in so let's think down the road in a hypothetical situation. There may be an instance where we come back and say, wow, this is really hard to achieve all the guiding principles and achieve population parity, and doing it with only 3 wards. So there may be a situation, thinking about other ward boundary reviews where we've done, where we weren't necessarily supposed to look at council composition, but we have come back and said, hey, if you think about adding a councillor or adding a ward in this case, because you're not changing the size, this might be or this might work out a little better, or you might be able to better achieve the guiding principles. But in this case, as Bob said, looking specifically, I could think about a review we just did, not too far from you guys, where that was part of our mandate, was to look at the role of deputy mayor. In the other way, it was the example that Bob just mentioned, where it was a deputy mayor that was selected, and they want us to look at whether it should be a position that's elected at large. So we have looked at that as, sorry, go ahead, Bob.
In that case, it was specifically a council composition review, and then the ward boundary would follow. If I remember correctly, in this scenario, that was on the table in some fashion for council, and they decided not to do that. I may be wrong. The clerk might be able to help me on that one.
So that's kind of our commentary on that. So as Bob said, I mean, if that's something we continue to hear, as in other reviews we've done, there were things that weren't necessarily part of our review, but that we heard over and over again from the public. We wouldn't be very thoughtful if we disregarded those comments. So again, if it's something we continue to hear, we may have to look at it, but it's not something that's part of our mandate right now. I'm gonna. The next comment was, how well attended have the 2 sessions been? So that's referring to the open house session. So we had one earlier today at 2. This is the second session at 7. I can't see who's here, who's not. I only see me and Bob. So I couldn't tell you who's attending tonight, but I can tell you, and the municipality will get us those numbers. I can tell you, as part of our reports, that's something we're very transparent about. So in the interim report that will be released in the new year, all the data with regard to public engagement, who attended the sessions, how many people, looked at tweets, how many people visited the website, all of that will be part of that next report. So we will provide that information to you.
And this session is being recorded, if I'm not mistaken, so people could access it even later on. So even if they're not in attendance when it's live, they will still be able to hear about what we've talked about. And again, that would be reflected in the report later. Let me also just add that, and I don't mean to put this down, but this is not a popularity contest. It's not a case of saying lots of people turned up and they all wanted this, so that's what we do. It's a way of gathering information. It's voluntary. People can turn up or not turn up. We appreciate the feedback they can give us through the multiple channels that are available, but it's not that we have to have a certain quantity of responses to make this a legitimate process. What we want to talk about is a set of arrangements that are in the interest of the municipality, that are based in part on what we heard, but also on the principles and the evidence that we can collect related to things like population growth and whatever.
Great. And the last comment, I think it's the last comment, is some commentary on urban, rural, residential, rural problems in a single ward. So that's a great question. It becomes very focal, I think, in Ontario and most of the ward boundary reviews outside of the large urban centers that are very dense, and it relates back to the guiding principles and some of the issues we talked about, that it starts to get difficult if you want population parity, and that becomes a primary basis for this ward boundary review. Then, and we'll see this more as we start to look at options in the next phase, but it becomes difficult to say, okay, we're going to have a ward or a system where all three wards are equal, yet we keep urban and rural interests separate. The reality is that rural areas are always sparsely populated, and to achieve any kind of population parity, you're going to have either this gigantic ward that Bob talked about earlier that might be impractical to achieve effective representation, or you might have a trade-off where you're going to have some sort of urban rural mix. Just on that point, and I know Bob can talk about this more than I can, but on that point, I mean, that's something that we do try to avoid, though. We do consider rural representation an important component of any ward boundary review we do, and that's why, to try to keep those interests separate, to try to keep those urban and rural interests somewhat separate in a ward boundary system, there is going to be an inevitable population trade-off. Bob, do you want to sort of build off that a little bit more and talk about some of these rural-urban issues that we encounter?
Yeah, and of course, in the context of Cavan Monaghan, it's got a very distinctive feature with essentially one reasonable size center at Millbrook and other smaller ones. My sense is that we would want to try to keep a ward based around Millbrook as close as we can to those urban, suburban, whatever we want to call them, interests, and not to basically toss in all kinds of rural interests into a ward simply for the sake of population or whatever. The trade-off is that the rural interests are different on a whole range of matters in terms of the kind of services they get, in terms of their lifestyle, if you will, the economic base. Let me put it differently. My perspective is to try to keep wards as coherent as possible, made up as much as possible of people with the same kinds of perspectives on what happens at the municipal level. How that's going to play out in Cavan Monaghan, I just don't quite know. Obviously, Millbrook and that settlement area is different than the rest of the township, and we should find a way to capture that in a ward. How the numbers are going to play out, we don't know. We haven't done any of this yet. But what kind of ward would you create around Millbrook that's equitable or close to parity? How far would you have to expand it? How close could you keep it? I don't know what the implications would be for the other wards, but certainly our sense is that you don't mix up all of those interests, especially I'm reluctant to see a ward that covers a lot of rural territory, but is essentially composed predominantly of urban people. And the distinctions are obviously relative in Cavan Monaghan. We're not talking about Brampton or Vaughan or whatever, but it's urban compared to the rest. You don't want to have a ward that essentially disadvantages rural people who happen to live close to that built up area. So our tendency would be to try to keep it as I said earlier, as coherent as possible.
Thanks,
I'm not
Bob.
sure if that's an answer to Al's question, but that would be our perspective on it.
Yeah,
My
and I think,
perspective on it.
and I agree, and I think we'll see more of that when we actually come up with options. And I think once we have a visual in front of you, you'll understand some of these concepts a little bit better. I noticed that Rod had his hand up, so I'm gonna unmute you, Rod. I think I just did that. Rod, if you can go ahead and ask your question. I think you're unmuted. Okay, I think we maybe lost him. Okay, I'll give a couple of seconds. We'll just start to conclude. And Rod, if you're still there and you can hear us, or if you want to let us know in the chat if you have a question, go ahead. But we'll wait for that. But in the meantime, again, I just want to thank everyone for participating tonight, especially the people who asked questions and provided some comments. We really appreciate that feedback. And like I said earlier, this is not your last chance to engage with us. So, Bob mentioned these sessions will be up on the website. So if you want to tell your friends, tell your family, if they weren't able to check it out tonight, they still have an opportunity to watch these sessions. The slide deck for the presentation will go up on the website. Again, like I said earlier, the survey's there, so please check it out. So again, thanks very much for taking the time to join us tonight. We hope that you found tonight's session informative, and have a wonderful night. Thank you.
Thank you.